It's the week ending Saturday the 27th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Prime Minister's 4-step roadmap for easing England's lockdown restrictions, Facebook lifting its block on news pages in Australia after a week-long standoff with the government, and golfing champion Tiger Woods suffering serious injuries in a car crash. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from Money Week, it's Mr. 2008 himself, John Stepek, and some fascinating freelancers alongside Sachandrika Chakrabarti and Arian McNichol. John, you are up first this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Can you save the world with your smartphone?
Suddenly, you go from feeling like you're alone to being part of a powerful movement with everyone encouraging and inspiring each other.
So that's what we want to build.
The Climate app.
A simple and fun app that allows you to track your actions and progress in reducing CO2 while being able to see what others are doing too.
There are countless things to track, but it all starts with you.
We need your help to create the Climate app.
Even the birds like it. A crowdfunding video there for the Climate app, founded by a NASA research scholar, Samuel Naif. And John, this week you bring us news of another digital carbon footprint tracker.
Yeah, this is basically in response. There was an interesting article on the BBC and also another one that I spotted on Vox this week. And it's all about using apps on your phone in much the same way as, the kind of apps that track the number of steps you do and, apps that kind of monitor your alcohol intake, all that sort of stuff, to track the amount of carbon that you're emitting and therefore help you to cut it back. So it's yet another kind of way to monitor ourselves and improve how we live in the world.
How do they practically work? Because, a fitness tracker can sort of, tell how many steps you're doing. But, an app on your phone can't tell how much petrol you've just put in your car.
Well, no, and obviously, it's a tricky thing to measure. I've downloaded a couple of apps and had a wee look at them. One of the main things that they look at is asking you, well, how much do you drive and how much do you walk? They ask you about how much do you fly. There's basically sort of 3 separate categories. How many flights do you take a year? What's your primary mode of transport? And what's your diet like? So are you a vegetarian or do you eat meat? And if you eat meat, do you eat a lot of beef or not very much beef?
I wonder about this because whenever the doctor asks me if I drink, I say, yeah, moderately, twice a week.
Yeah, I know, but we all lie to the doctor. It's whether or not we're going to lie to ourselves is a slightly different issue. I think the kind of people who download these apps probably want to be a bit more honest about it. But you're right. Obviously, if you are walking around using a Fitbit, then it does track the number of steps you take quite straightforwardly. Whereas with this sort of thing, as you say, you're going to have to tell it how much you've driven.
So you downloaded it for journalistic purposes, John. Would you be the kind of person that might download this thing, in real life?
Honestly, no. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that I feel that we're far too obsessed with monitoring ourselves anyway. I feel there's a kind of general kind of narcissism and also a kind of almost desperately anal kind of drive to track and analyse everything that we do from the minute we get up in the morning to the minute we go to bed, and actually during the night as well. So I'm not sure that this overall is a healthy thing. But in terms of this specifically, I guess my scepticism comes from a number of areas. First is it's quite difficult to track this sort of thing anyway. It doesn't know how many miles I'm driving or how much cow I'm eating or whatever. And then secondly, there's also the whole question of whether this is the most helpful way to go about addressing climate change. Does it?
Well, that's a biggie. Let's park that one for a second and deal with what John calls the narcissism, Sachandrika, because we know that Fitbits and things like that, they influence behaviour because of the peer pressure. People share the data socially. You ask anyone wearing a fitness tracker how many times they've taken the stairs rather than the lift, and they will tell you that they have. So it's pushing you into better behaviour. It does work in that sense, whether it's narcissistic or not.
Yeah, I think so in that BBC article that John was talking about, they have a quote from Emma Kisby, who's the managing director of Kogo, an app that helps you make your spending more ethical. And she says people love seeing and tracking their carbon footprint. Now, I don't. I barely like tracking my steps. Like, they've not looked good in the last year, I have to tell you. It's really hard to get to 10,000. So I don't feel I'm really being spoken to in that audience, even though generally we're talking about millennials. I think that's who John is probably referring to when he talks about narcissism. So this tracking isn't really for me. I actually got an email from my bank the other day, like tracking how I'd used my app in the last year. And obviously it was like groceries and sitting down. Like, I wasn't buying anything else. It was a sad pie chart, but I didn't really like the intrusion. But what I would say is she's talking about a kind of audience, like the app is singing to the choir. They already care about these things. So the app isn't really reaching, or these apps aren't really reaching people who don't care. But also, I think it gives us the illusion of control and not actual control over how we consume carbon and how we affect the environment, because these decisions are actually taken on a bigger scale. It's about who we buy from and how we use transport, and we don't have complete control over those things.
Yeah, they're taken on a bigger scale, Arian, but they too, big industry could be nudged by individuals being interested in this data.
I think that's right. And I think that while there are obviously reasons to be skeptical about these apps, particularly if you're just tracking yourself and that's as far as the data's going, the thing that I think is quite interesting about the latest generation of apps, and the climate app is one of them. There's another one that I saw coming out soon called Capture, but they've got this baked-in social dimension. And I think as long as there's some sort of outreach that connects your individual data to other people, then they can potentially make some sort of a difference. And that can be in one of two ways. One, you can challenge your friends to do better, and you can show them how well you're doing, and so there can be that immediate connection among social groups.
Unless, of course, sending a message via social media has a carbon footprint itself.
Oh, true.
Yeah.
Well, that's a thinker that we should consider. But I think the second aspect of it is the business of the way that your use of this app could potentially communicate with, for example, governments and corporations. And I think the big question that maybe John was going to get to is that distinction between individual responsibility for climate change versus corporate and governmental. And I think if you could link these apps up to make that connection better, so that you could, for example, speak to governments or speak to corporations about how you want them to do better, then I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about that bit then, John, which is a big conversation. But just from this point of view, could there even, if you were putting your tinfoil hat on, be something a bit nefarious about big business, people like Apple and Microsoft and Google, pushing us to download apps like this to make us feel like we're doing the right thing, when actually it is big business that needs to make these decisions, not us as individuals?
Look, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't agree with that, because I don't tend to. The easy thing to do with all of these things is to accuse big business, and this is one of my big issues with the green movement in general, is this sort of...
I was positing, I wasn't accusing.
No. There's a sort of fringe section that, well, actually not a significant, large fringe section that sort of feels that the answer to this is to wind back capitalism and go back to some form of living in somewhere between the Stone Age and a kind of idyllic English village, which is just completely deranged. So and the sort of opposition to economic growth. You saw all the adults applauding that Greta Thunberg line about all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of economic growth, and that's pathetic to watch adults applaud that. Yes, I expect and forgive and almost advocate those politics in a teenager, but once you're 30 and you're sitting in a room in Davos somewhere or wherever they were,
all right,
you shouldn't be clapping
off your high horse. So answer the question. Isn't it the case that corporations need to take responsibility, governments need to take responsibility for this, really?
Aye. Actually, I mean, I would actually say governments probably more than corporations. I mean, a good example is, so Britain's overall carbon dioxide emissions have dropped by a third in the last decade, and the single reason for that is because we've stopped using coal. That's it. Now, consumers can do what they like, and consumers should certainly put pressure on people. And actually, I do think that is a positive about these apps. I agree with Arian from that point of view. It's kind of like encouraging consumer choice and consumer pressure, and that's a good thing. But what it boils down to is, as I say, we've stopped using coal, and it's very difficult for us to then pressurise other countries' governments, for example, to kind of stop using coal simply through our choices. I mean, on the other hand, you can argue that that does now leave a lot more room for individuals to act, because actually in Britain, we've stopped using coal, and therefore the kind of things that will cut our carbon footprint now are people moving away from using cars as much. So now, in an interesting kind of way, our individual choice does now matter more because one of the biggest steps has been taken.
But it needs to be big steps, doesn't it, Suchandrika? If you're talking about it on an individual basis, so if you've seen these graphs that sort of show what the carbon fair share of the world would be, if we all took an equitable stake in our carbon emissions, then all of us in Britain, and everyone listening to this basically in Europe and America, would be in the world's wealthiest 10%. And we'd all need to cut our carbon emissions by 90% if it's going to be genuinely fair and distributed across the world.
Yeah, exactly. And how far can we do that on our own without the infrastructure, without help from the government? And I have to go back to sort of big firms as well, because our buying habits do contribute to this stuff. So I went and looked at plastic bags, because that was the kind of last big initiative where we were given individual responsibility to have an impact on the environment. So back in October 2015, plastic bags in England were charged at 5p a go, and Wales and Scotland did it differently on different days. And so the UK government said in 2019 that sales of plastic bags by the 7 biggest retailers have fallen by 90% since that 5p charge was introduced. Amazing, that sounds really good. But then Channel 4 Fact Check got involved, and they found out that people are buying bags for life instead. So they went to all the big brands, and Tesco and Sainsbury's wouldn't give their figures, and Co-op, M&S and Waitrose said between them they'd sold nearly 60 million bags for life in 2018 to 2019, and that is a decrease of less than 2% on 2017 to 18. So it seems to me that with the plastic bag situation, that was when I did change my behaviour. I do take a little cotton tote bag with me everywhere I go all the time.
You're not someone who wants to get fleeced for 5p in Sainsbury's, Chandrika.
Absolutely.
You're a woman with
not.
a head on her shoulders, yeah.
So I do that. I'm one of the choir I've been preached to. But actually, it feels to me they've just rebranded the problem, and it's gone from one-time, one-use only plastic bags to have a bag for life and pick up a new one next time. But the thing is, shops have to provide some level of bag for consumers coming in, otherwise they'll lose customers really quickly. But are they making fewer plastic bags? If you look at a bag for life, it actually seems to have more plastic than a single-use plastic bag. Is it made in a more green way? I don't know, it's very complicated. But it seems to be the plastic bag situation for me, it put all the kind of responsibility on us as individuals, but actually we don't have a ton of choice. And it didn't change behaviour that much.
But I think both of those examples kind of highlight the way that the movement on the issue of climate change needs to be kind of co-evolutionary between technology, governmental regulation, then individual companies, and then individual users. And I think that if, for example, if you're given the opportunity to use better plastic bags and fewer of them, then you're going to have the opportunity to flex your individual, moral ideology in regard to climate change in that way. And if the government starts to phase out coal, like John was talking about, then that's another major step. But all of these things need to happen hand in hand.
All right, Arian, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Arian, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A controversy in athletics looks set to run and run.
A person in the street could say, well, why would you not use them? Because they give you an advantage. The same people might say, well, why don't you allow doping? Because that can be accessible to everybody, and if it doesn't harm them, then why can't they just do doping? And some people have suggested that the shoe issue right now is a form of mechanical doping.
Former IAAF official and running coach Peter Thompson talking to the Wall Street Journal last year about Nike's Vaporfly running shoes. Arian, what's happened this week?
So this week there's been just this building debate over the issue of so-called super shoes, into which category Vaporfly falls in athletics. And it's been precipitated by Elliot Giles, who's a UK athlete who's never reached the world finals before, who ran the second fastest indoor 800-metre time in history, smashing Seb Coe's record in the process. And he was wearing these Nike Air Zoom Victory Spikes when he did it, and has spent the subsequent week defending his achievement and saying, look, it wasn't down to the shoes, which a lot of commentators have started to suggest, it was down to my athletic prowess.
Yeah, he said it was an insult to suggest that he'd broken the record only because he was wearing super shoes. But what's the case against? I mean, why do people think it might be the shoes?
Well, partly because there have been so many world records that have been tumbling in recent months, a really unusual number. So, for example, the men's 5,000 metres and 10,000 metres have seen new world records set, and the women's 5,000 metres has also had a new world record. And in all of these, there has been the presence of not only these Nike shoes, and Nike's made a bunch of them for different distances, but a lot of the other manufacturers have been catching up. And it could be down to a number of things, but a lot of people are wondering whether it is these shoes themselves.
John, do you know what it is that makes these shoes so special then? Like, how is their design actually different to normal running shoes?
Well, basically, they've got more padded soles that can incorporate carbon plate. Now, I don't know very much about running. I avoid it like the plague, but it basically enables them to run with more energy. So I guess that it's enough to just give you that little bit of edge that you need at that level of performance.
Right. So is having a little bit of edge, Suchandra, really equivalent to doping? I mean, that's what Peter Thompson was saying in the clip we heard, that this is mechanical doping because you're wearing some new sneakers.
So I thought there's a really good quote in an opinion piece on this subject by Sean Ingle in The Guardian, and he was quoting a biomechanics expert and leading voice on shoe technology, which is a great job title. So a guy called Jeff Burns, he says, in athletics, times and performances are our currencies, but some shoe companies have printed a bunch more money and we've just had inflation. So it seems like there's been like a leap in that technology, which is clearly reflected in all of these records just tumbling, in all of these leaps forward in what the human body can do. Suddenly there's this technology that clearly really works. It's just been tested on a sort of international stage, and people are now questioning, is it an extension of the human body, or is it something more than the human body? Is it actually doping? To me, it's so good, and the fact that so few people have had access to it, it feels as unfair as doping at the moment, but it might become the standard quite soon.
That's an interesting point, isn't it, Arian? I mean, obviously anyone at an elite level has access to it because they're given the shoes by their sponsors. But to become an elite athlete, if you're from a poor country, you maybe can't afford a $100 pair of shoes.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that the authorities in athletics are looking to regulate, which is fair access to these technologies. And you'd think that at least that would solve one problem, which is it levels the playing field. If everyone's running in the same shoes, then you've all got the same unfair advantage. But if only some athletes have got them, then there's an obvious problem. But I think the other issue that they're grappling with is how this impacts historical records. How we look at, for example, Usain Bolt's previous 100 metres achievement, if that record now gets beaten by someone who's wearing super springy shoes. So I think that is a legitimate question to try to think not just of it's an individual generation, but the whole history of athletics and human achievement.
Well, John, you're our numbers man. I mean, what do you think? It's nice, isn't it, as a sports fan, to be able to try and compare like for like and do nerdy league tables and say, in 1967 this was faster. But I mean, that's maybe a nice to have against the alternative of stopping technology from helping people.
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one. But I also think that as the distance gets greater, partly we're thinking about this now because it's people who we all know, like Usain Bolt and Seb Coe. But at the end of the day, I mean, the whole thing that I always remember is the 4-minute mile was seen as impossible. Then one person did it, and then rapidly it disappeared. So pinning down, the gap between technology and also just between achievement and motivation is one thing. And there's also, I mean, there's things like, we talk about doping, but diets have got to have improved over the last 50 years for everyone. I think it's very difficult to compare these things over time. And I think that you can probably turn around and, I thought the inflation line actually was very good there. I thought that, in a way, what's happened is that, yes, performances have been inflated, and you could adjust it for real terms. So like Usain Bolt was the fastest man in the world in this year because that was the pinnacle of human achievement. But now the pinnacle's gone further simply because we have better tech. I think where this then does get tricky is what's the dividing line between acceptable tech and things like actual bionic kind of interventions, which is kind of like somewhere in between doping and technology. But that just all boils down to, well, where do we draw the line in terms of what counts as human performance and what counts as augmented performance? And that's always going to be tricky.
There was a good line in the Times piece on this that said that these new shoes are turning a foot race into an arms race. And I think that that is legitimate. And if looking at history is anything to go by, it's not as if this is the first time that regulation has controlled athletics or sport in general. And if you look back to the London 2012 Olympics, for example, that was the year when they banned the Speedo laser fast suits that were these all-over body suits that kind of emulated shark's skin. And you'd seen all of these swimming records being smashed in 2008 in Beijing, and then they were like, actually, we probably don't want to just make this sport all about the suit that you're wearing, and so they regulated those. So, you know, you can see why, looking back at precedent at least, there's reason here again to step in and go, well, here's the amount of squishy foam you can use, and here's the amount of carbon fibre, for example.
But also, Suchandra, if you follow the money, I mean, the fortunes of Nike and Adidas and Puma are so entwined with elite sport that if you want to compete at a professional level, you need that sponsorship to be able to afford to train to compete. And those sponsors want to give you the latest version of their shoes because actually it's about telling the man in the street, I'll go and buy this pair of shoes because you'll be 2% faster like Usain Bolt.
Yeah, I agree that it's kind of follow the money and then become an advert for them. And so it's really interesting that Elliot Giles says it's an insult to say that it was about his shoes. He's like refusing to be the advert, even though it's so clear that he's just suddenly come out of nowhere and reached this time that he wasn't reaching before. So it insults the athletes almost in the inbuilt sense of having achieved something, like they've trained their entire lives, probably maybe given up quite a lot and lived quite isolated lives. And so they've done all of that, and then all the kind of credit is being given to the shoes. So do they have any motivation apart from the money?
I was also thinking about how it kind of shows the deception that we've all been being fed for so long, that this is the moment where actual authorities needed to step in and say, actually, these shoes do something. You know, how long have we been bombarded with adverts saying, if you buy this football boot, then you're going to be that much more accurate and that much faster? But it just wasn't true. Until this moment, at least with running, obviously, it wasn't true. And they've just gone, oh, holy crap, we're going to have to do something about this now.
I mean, I suppose, John, actually, I mentioned Usain Bolt because he's the shorthand, isn't he? Because, like, almost anyone in the world, and they'll say, well, that's the fastest person in the world. So actually, when extraordinary talent comes through, everybody knows, and it doesn't matter what shoes they're wearing.
I mean, yeah, I suppose the question then is, but do you get to come through if you don't have the shoes? I guess that, you know, if these shoes can make relatively ordinary people who could obviously still thrash the rest of us, but aren't necessarily the elite of the elite, then it does make it harder for, you know, I guess it's back to being one of these access things, isn't it? Because eventually, yeah, everyone would have these shoes, or they'll be banned. I suppose it's also like the F1 thing. It's like, what separates a good driver from an incredible car? And that's very unclear a lot of the time. You know, it's like certain teams win all the time because they've got the best car, not because they've necessarily got the best driver.
And so maybe a more sophisticated discussion about this, Suchandra, is saying, because obviously in the case of a runner, they don't have a car, it is their legs. But I mean, they do have an incredible team around them. And actually, maybe sometimes the best runner does have the best team. And that will include the shoes, but it will also include the regime. It will include the dedication, and it will include the money.
Yes, it'll include all of these things, you're right. And it'll also include other updates to like the track and to the environment they're running in. So I had a quick look at author David Epstein. He wrote The Sports Gene and he had a TED Talk. I didn't watch it, I read the Cliff Notes. But he basically compares Usain Bolt to Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens won the 1936 Olympics in 10.2 seconds and would have come last in the 2013 race when Usain Bolt set his record of 9.77 seconds. But Epstein believes this is totally down to technology and advances in human understanding of how we should lay the track and so on. So the track that Jesse Owens ran on was a soft surface made of wood ash, whereas Usain Bolt ran on engineered carpet. Didn't know it was called that. And the start of the race was very different. So Owens had to dig himself small holes before he got up and ran. So that, imagine the time it takes to get up, to dig them and then to get up out of them and run. Whereas Bolt had starting blocks. So both those gave Bolt a huge advantage. So if you analyse these differences, Owens would have been within a stride of Bolt instead of 14 feet behind him. So do we actually look at the knowledge we've accrued over time to make the surface of the track better and say, no, we're not going to use that knowledge that we've accrued? Like, that doesn't seem to make sense either.
Okay. Ollie Mann wears slippers by Barber. The podcaster's choice. So Chandrika, you're up next after this. Chandrika, you are finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this Uber but for art?
I'm very interested in the imaginary, our ability to have hope that tomorrow or the future is better than the past, right? So now we are spending a lot of time indoor. So I thought, okay, let's make a work of art which takes the outside inside. It's called Wunderkammer. I'm working on it together with Acute Art. And essentially, it's an augmented reality experience. And what it does is that it takes the things that you probably know already, the sun, a cloud. Think of this as a celebration of what is tomorrow and where we're actually heading, more than just escapism. It's about reality. Even though it's augmented, it's actually very real.
A video from artist Alafu Eliasson launching his latest release, Wunderkammer. So Chandrika, what is the story?
So he's talking about his new artwork, Wunderkammer, which involves sort of bringing nature inside. And one of the things he has is a giant floating sun, which originally lit up the Tate Modern. But now using an app from Acute Art, you can have it in your home virtually.
Can you, though? I can't have something from the Tate Modern in my house.
I mean, you could try it. But so you use the app and it's augmented reality. So you can kind of get your phone, get the app up, and then use the phone to have a virtual version of the sun or another part of his artwork in your home.
Okay, so you described it as Uber for art, but really this is Pokemon Go, but for art, isn't it?
A bit more. I was trying to be mysterious.
So why is this your story of the week? What do you think is the significance of this?
So the question, I suppose, is post-pandemic. So he's talking about being on lockdown, but, you know, we're going to be coming out of lockdown later this year. And the question is, do we want to be able to order in art experiences? So the last episode of Culture Unwrapped took a look at art buyers and what's going to happen to art galleries in lockdown. Millennials in particular buying art online. But now it's worth thinking, do these apps help artists' incomes? Can they sell more art with the use of these virtual kind of apps that allow people to look around the art in their own homes and decide if they want to buy them that way?
Okay. So, John, Chandrika thinks that AR could be the future of try before you buy art. I think that's what we're getting at here. Do you agree?
I mean, I find AR fascinating, and I think that it's got a lot of potential to take off. But we're actually already seeing art that only exists in a digital plane rather than art that is physical but then represented virtually, going for absolutely crazy prices. And this, as you may not be surprised to hear, is all got something to do with cryptocurrencies and blockchain. This is a thing called NFTs. Now, I'm going to get a little bit technical, but I will keep it quick. So an NFT is a non-fungible token, right? And what that means is that it's unique. That's what it means. So what's happening is that people are buying bits of digital art that are associated with NFTs. So they are basically the NFT. So it means that the art itself is unique. And it means that your ownership is traced on the blockchain, which is the same giant database that Bitcoin runs off, and it's why Bitcoin works. So it kind of solves the problem of, because obviously if something's digital, then anyone can have a copy of it. But with this, you've got something digital that you know that you own and only you own. And prices for stuff are going crazy. Like people have bought, I was just reading a Wired article about it, where somebody bought a virtual racing car for $100,000. People are buying like little digital doodles for thousands and thousands of dollars and then selling them on.
I mean, it's all very interesting, Arian, but it does actually kind of come down to another question we were asking in that episode of Culture Unwrapped, which is how much of this pandemic stuff is going to still be with us in, let's say, 2 years' time, to play it safe. You know, in 2 years' time, won't people just be desperate to get back out to exhibitions and galleries and look at art in the traditional way? And the last thing they'll want to do, whether owning it or viewing it, is looking at their smartphone. I
think that's a really interesting question. And you know, coming back to that idea of, is this a way that you could try before you buy, or is this another way that you could experience famous art from around the world and bring Michelangelo's David into your own house, or, you know, throw something up that's never been seen before? I think that's interesting while we're all stuck in our own houses. But I do feel as though there's going to come a time in the not too distant future where the simple reality is that we're going to want to get out there and see it in the real world. And there's a reason why people feel titillated by seeing the actual Mona Lisa rather than seeing a reproduction on their computer screen, which, let's face it, has been available for ages.
Well, this is it. You've been able to buy the poster in the pound shop for 20 years.
Right.
But it doesn't change the interest of people to go to the Louvre, does it?
No. And I suppose that, the other interesting thing about what's being done here is that they actually are creating, as John was talking about, specifically digital artworks that can be sold for actual real world money. And I think that for Acute Art, the company that's working in conjunction with Eliasson, that they're going to really have to prove that they, as a specific real world company, can make actual money out of what they're doing. Because so far it's been kind of an experimental laboratory where you can bring his Tate Modern son into your house or whatever. But they actually are now experimenting with ways that they could, for example, rent artworks to people, if not sell them.
Also, Suchandrika, we could have been having actually a version of this conversation 10 years ago when they were developing Google Glass, and that was going to be the next big thing, people wearing AR specs as they walk around. And it turned out the public just didn't really want to do that. As long as it's on your phone and it's not on your face, you're just basically looking at your phone, aren't you? So I wonder if there's just actually a limited audience.
I think the pandemic has really pushed a lot of us into considering virtual options that we wouldn't have done otherwise, for instance, using a Zoom to make a podcast. So there is that for some people, they won't want to go back. But also there's a kind of access option as well. When we talk about having Michelangelo's David in our front room, for some people, those flights to Florence are possibly not within their range, either because of money or because they don't want to have the carbon hit from those flights, going back to the carbon emission stuff. So it could be that it's used for learning as well. There's different kinds of virtual learning we might keep hold of, and people can maybe be doing art history from their homes if they really wanted to. It depends on how good the virtual David is, I suppose.
I agree with you though, Ollie, that AR still isn't that exciting because you're still having to use it through a dumb interface. I actually had the chance to try one of those Google Glass things, and that seemed exciting. When you've got a heads-up display in the corner of your eye and you're just able to walk around and get directions, for example, with this overlay of the real world, that's cool. But having to get your phone out and point it at the table and go, oh yeah, okay, so there's a sun, it's just unfun,
What an excited reaction you're having to this cutting edge art.
I think that's a good point, Arian, and I think that if Google Glass or something similar was made today, we'd have a different reaction to it. The main problem with Google Glass was the privacy aspect, and people get really angry about the idea that there were all these tech bros wandering around Silicon Valley recording all their conversations. I've got a feeling that the negative reaction at that point wouldn't be the same now, partly because we're all used to having basically no privacy at all. One thing I've always thought is, imagine you could visit the Colosseum in Rome and stick on a pair of specs and watch a virtual gladiator fight or something like that. Do you know what I mean? I think that would be incredible. I mean, there's got so many potential killer applications, AR. It's just a matter of someone... I've got a feeling that at some point it will take off. It's just they need to find the thing that makes it, really popular.
Well, maybe it's a generational thing, but I do think, we talk about people having Zoom fatigue and people just getting to the point now where they just don't want constantly to be thinking about that fourth dimension, their version of themselves, their avatar on social media. They just want to actually engage with what's in front of them. Maybe there's just a weariness for people, I don't know, aged 30 plus at the moment, that just can't really be... I just find it difficult to imagine that you'd voluntarily want to impose that dimension on the one place where you don't need it, walking around, talking to people, sniffing the air.
But you can think about it like this. You can think about it as like a premium experience in your home. So you can have these kind of art installations that you can interact with, and it's a bit like art meeting gaming. And so the buyers are going to have different motives when they're buying this piece of art. They're going to be millennials buying online. They don't just want to look at their money hanging on the walls. They want to interact with this stuff and actually have it do something for them, as opposed to just accruing value over time. So if you look at art in a slightly different way and as something that, as the person who receives it, you have a part to play in making it as well. And then you can see that it becomes a really different thing to have in your home and something that you'd want to put on Instagram. You want to take a video of it. You want to show it off.
Yes. And actually, I fell into this trap as well, Arian, of sort of asking, is this ever going to replace art? People, because it's framed as art, ask that question. But really, it probably is closer to a video game, isn't it? and it's just going to be one type of kind of gaming type experience. It's not going to replace art. It's just uses influences from both.
Definitely. And also, it has a bunch of different applications. It's also an R&D exercise for the companies that get involved. It's not just Acute Art who are doing this. You've also got Google, Facebook, all the big players. They're all in this space, working with artists to try to advance AR and develop the sorts of things that their engineers haven't thought of yet. And the other positive aspect is the PR side of it. That when you go to a gallery or you have a gallery brought to your home by Google or by Microsoft, then you're going to think more positively of them if you have a fun experience. So I think that there's a whole lot of potential positive benefits to this that are not straightforward.
Well, again, I think we have triumphantly blurred the lines between art and podcasting this week. Thank you to John, Arian and Suchandrika for so artfully weaving their stories in reality onto the show. Remember, you can subscribe to the podcast for free, no bitcoins required. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.